Nephew graduations were, in the Kostas family, treated as events of near religious significance, and Adrian's, the first grandchild to graduate college, a business degree from a school their father, Peter, had wanted for himself 40 years earlier and never gotten, brought out the entire extended family to a reception hall in Astoria with a buffet of spanakopita and a rented sound system playing bouzouki music at a volume nobody had requested. Nadia Kostas stood near the edge of the room with a plate she wasn't eating from, watching her father work the crowd, accepting congratulations for a grandson's achievement as though he'd personally supervised every exam, and felt the specific, low-grade dread she always felt at these gatherings. Not fear exactly, but a kind of bracing, the tightening a person does before a wave they've seen coming for a while. It came during the toasts, when Peter, 3 glasses of metaxa into the evening, decided the occasion called for a broader reflection on the family's achievements, and included Nadia in that reflection in the specific way he always did, as a cautionary footnote rather than a subject in her own right. Adrian is going to do something with his life, Peter said, raising his glass toward his grandson, then, without quite meaning to pivot but pivoting anyway, glancing toward Nadia. Not everyone in this family made the choices they should have. You threw your life away being stubborn, he said, directly to her now, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, his tone somewhere between grief and accusation. No husband, no children, nothing to show for it. 41 years old. Nadia's mother, Elena, dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, not disagreeing, her silence its own kind of agreement, the particular silence of a woman who had spent 2 decades absorbing her husband's disappointments as though they were weather rather than opinion. Nadia sat still. She had learned, over many years and many gatherings exactly like this one, that stillness was the only response that didn't cost her anything further. Anger gave her father a target. Explanation gave him an opening. Stillness, at least, was hers alone. Uncontestable, a small private country he couldn't invade. She had, in fact, a husband. She had, in fact, 2 daughters, 12 and 9. She had, in fact, spent the last 14 years building an investment holding company with controlling interests across 4 sectors: logistics, renewable energy infrastructure, specialty manufacturing, and, most recently, healthcare technology, that managed, as of that spring, roughly $340 million in assets. Her father knew none of it, because 17 years earlier, at 24, Nadia had made a decision her family had never forgiven and she had never fully explained. She had left the small accounting firm her father ran, the one he'd assumed she would inherit and eventually run herself, to take a junior analyst position at a private equity firm 3,000 miles away. A decision Peter had experienced not as career ambition but as personal rejection, a verdict on the value of everything he'd built. 2. Why Peter believed what he believed. Peter Kostas had built Kostas & Associates from a single rented desk in 1979, a small accounting practice serving Greek immigrant families and small businesses across Queens, work he had done with genuine pride and genuine skill for 4 decades. He had raised Nadia and her older brother, Dmitry, believing, with total sincerity, that the greatest gift he could offer them was a business already built, a path already cleared, a future that required only the courage to walk into it rather than the terror of building one from nothing the way he'd had to. When Dmitry took over the firm at 26, Peter had experienced a kind of completion he rarely spoke about but clearly felt, the specific satisfaction of watching a life's work continue past his own hands. When Nadia, 2 years later, declined the same offer, choosing instead a career in an industry Peter didn't understand and couldn't picture, doing work he couldn't explain to his own clients when they asked what his daughter did, Peter experienced it not as a difference of professional temperament, but as a referendum on the life he'd built, proof, in his reading of it, that what he'd made wasn't good enough to be wanted. He was not, in his own understanding of himself, a cruel man. He believed, sincerely, that a woman without a husband and children by 41 had failed at the most important assignment of a life, because that had been the operating framework of every family he'd grown up around, every model available to him, and he had never once been forced to update it, because Nadia had never given him the information that would have required updating it. He filled the silence with the only story that made sense to him, that his daughter had chased something abstract and lost, that stubbornness had cost her the concrete things, marriage, children, a business with her name on the door, that he understood as the actual measure of a life. 3. The life she didn't explain. What Peter didn't know, what nobody in the Kostas family knew, was nearly everything about the last 17 years. He didn't know that Nadia had met her husband, Marcus Bell, during her second year at the private equity firm, a soft-spoken structural engineer she'd been seated next to at a mutual friend's dinner party, a man who had never once, in 14 years together, made her feel like her ambition needed managing or apologizing for. He didn't know they'd married in a small courthouse ceremony in San Francisco 11 years earlier, 6 guests total, none of them Kostas family, a decision Nadia had made deliberately, protectively, after watching what happened to her cousin's wedding when Peter had turned the reception into an opportunity to relitigate an old business dispute with the groom's father. He didn't know about Amara, 12, sharp and quietly fierce, already running a small resale business out of her bedroom reselling sneakers she sourced through online drops, a hustle Nadia found both hilarious and deeply, uncomfortably familiar. He didn't know about Simone, 9, gentle and stubborn in equal measure, obsessed with marine biology, who had memorized the full taxonomic classification of every whale species by the age of 7 and corrected adults, politely but firmly, when they got the details wrong. He didn't know that Nadia had left the private equity firm at 29 to start her own holding company, Meridian Bell Capital, with $40,000 of savings and a business plan built on a specific thesis nobody else in the industry was pursuing at the time, that infrastructure serving overlooked mid-sized manufacturing hubs in the Midwest and South, unglamorous and unfashionable to coastal investors, represented enormous, unrealized value. He didn't know about the 18-month stretch in year 3 when the firm nearly folded, when Nadia and Marcus had refinanced their apartment and Marcus had taken on freelance engineering contracts at night to cover the gap, a period Nadia still thought of as the hardest of her adult life and never mentioned to her family, because mentioning it would have required mentioning the company that caused it. He didn't know about her best friend and co-founder, Priya Deshmukh, who Nadia had recruited from a rival fund in year 2 and who now ran Meridian Bell's healthcare technology division, the newest and fastest growing of the firm's 4 sectors. He didn't know about Nadia's Sunday morning tradition of taking both daughters to the community garden 2 blocks from their house, a plot she'd maintained for 6 years, entirely unrelated to any professional identity, where she grew tomatoes badly and dahlias well, and talked to her daughters about nothing important while her hands were in the dirt. He didn't know that Nadia had, 3 years earlier, quietly funded a full scholarship program at the community college near her firm's Ohio manufacturing sites, covering tuition for 41 students a year, named, with a specificity that meant something only to her, after nobody in particular, deliberately anonymous, because Nadia had wanted the giving to exist entirely outside the story of who she was or wasn't in her family's eyes. She had built an entire life, in other words, in the specific, deliberate absence of her family's awareness of it, not because she was ashamed of any of it, but because she had learned, painfully at 24, that sharing her choices with her father meant subjecting them to a verdict she no longer needed and could no longer afford to keep seeking. 4. The group chat. The family group chat, called Kostas Family Greece, existed mostly for logistics, who was bringing what at Easter, whether anyone had heard from Yaya's doctor, the occasional forwarded article about Greek politics nobody actually read. Nadia kept it on mute, checking it once every few days out of a low sense of obligation rather than interest. It was her cousin's husband, Teddy, technically family by marriage, genuinely well-meaning, a man who worked in finance and followed business media the way other people followed sports, who posted the link, 6 weeks after the graduation, with no context beyond genuine, uncomplicated excitement. Anyone see this? Forbes just dropped their America's Most Powerful Families Under 45 list. Check out who's on page 1 eyes. Nadia's phone buzzed with a notification while she was at her office in downtown Cincinnati, in a Tuesday afternoon meeting with Priya, reviewing the healthcare technology division's quarterly numbers, and she almost didn't check it, assuming it was another article about tax policy someone would argue about for 2 days before abandoning. She checked it that evening, at home, after the girls were in bed, and felt her stomach drop in a way she hadn't anticipated, because she had, in fact, participated in the Forbes profile, a family feature, not a solo one of 11 households selected across the country, photographed together as a condition of inclusion the magazine's editors had been firm about, arguing that the piece was specifically about the family structures behind rising wealth, not just the individuals. Nadia had agreed to it reluctantly, 6 months earlier, at Marcus's gentle urging. At some point, sweetheart, you have to let people see the whole thing, not just the company, and had mostly forgotten, in the intervening months, that it was still scheduled to run. The photograph was exactly what Teddy's screenshot showed. Nadia in the center, Marcus beside her, Amara and Simone in front, all 4 of them on the back deck of their house. Photographed in the soft late-afternoon light Nadia recognized instantly as a Sunday in early spring. The caption beneath the photo read, Nadia Kostas Bell, 41, founder and CEO, Meridian Bell Capital, controlling interest across 4 sectors, $340 million in assets under management. The silence, then the ring. Nadia sat with her phone for a long time after reading it, feeling the specific vertigo of watching 2 entirely separate lives, the one she'd built and the one her family believed she'd failed to build, collapse into the same frame without her permission. Her father read it, according to what she pieced together later from her mother, twice through, sitting at his kitchen table with his glasses pushed up on his forehead, saying nothing for several minutes, while Elena watched him from across the room, uncertain whether to speak. Then he called. Nadia watched his name appear on the screen, Baba, and let it ring. She was not deciding in that moment to punish him exactly, though she understood it might land that way. She was, more simply, not ready. 17 years of careful, deliberate omission did not resolve itself in the time it took a phone to ring 6 times before going to voicemail. Amara wandered into the kitchen in pajamas, having come down for water, and glanced at the phone still lit up on the counter. Mom, why is Grandpa calling? It's late. Nadia looked at her daughter, sharp, watchful, already old enough to read the tension in a room before being told what caused it, and made a decision, mid-sentence, about how much truth a 12-year-old could hold. He just found out you exist, Nadia said. Amara considered this with the specific gravity she brought to most surprising information. How did he not know that already? That's a longer conversation, Nadia said. Go back to bed. We'll talk tomorrow. 6. The voicemail. Peter left a voicemail, eventually, after the 3rd unanswered call, and Nadia listened to it twice before deciding what to do with it. Nadia, his voice said, rougher than she remembered, thinner. I saw the article. I don't understand. Call me, please. Your mother's very upset. I don't know what I am. Call me. She did not call that night. She called 2 days later, on a Thursday evening, sitting alone in her car in the office parking garage after Priya had left, because she found she needed a space that belonged to neither her family history nor her domestic life to have this particular conversation. You have grandchildren, Nadia said, without preamble, once her father picked up. 2. Amara and Simone. 12 and 9. You have a son-in-law named Marcus who's been asking me for years to introduce him to you, and I kept saying not yet, and I want you to understand that the not yet was never about him. It was about you. Why didn't you tell us? Peter's voice cracked on the question, and Nadia heard, underneath the shock, something she hadn't expected to hear, not just wounded pride but genuine grief, the specific grief of a man realizing he had missed 12 years and 9 years of 2 granddaughters' entire lives. Because the last time I told you something real about my life, you told me I'd thrown it away, Nadia said. At Adrian's graduation, 6 weeks ago, in front of 40 people. No husband, no children, nothing to show for it. I had both sitting at home, and I didn't correct you because I'd stopped believing correcting you ever changed anything. I stopped a long time ago, giving you material to use against me. That's what silence was. Not punishment. Self-preservation. I would never have said that if I'd known. That's exactly the problem, Baba. Nadia's voice was steady, not raised, but carrying a weight that made Peter go quiet on the other end. You only extend basic respect to the version of my life that matches what you already expected. If I told you the truth, you'd have found some other way to make it insufficient. Too late a marriage, too small a wedding you weren't invited to, work you don't understand instead of the firm you wanted me to run. I didn't withhold my life from you because I was ashamed of it. I withheld it because I was tired of watching you find new ways to make my choices about your disappointment.
The Elena.
Her mother called separately later that week, her voice smaller, the specific smallness of a woman who had spent decades absorbing her husband's certainties as her own and was only now, at 68, beginning to examine what that absorption had cost. I should have asked you more, Elena said. All these years. I told myself it wasn't my place, that your father handled the disagreements, and I just kept the peace. I think I was afraid that if I asked too many questions, I'd find out things that would make it harder to keep the peace. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me suspected there was more to your life than what we saw, and I chose not to look, because looking would have meant taking a side. You could have just asked how I was, Mom. Not taken a side. Just asked. I know, Elena said. I know that now. I don't think I understood, until I saw that photograph, how much of your actual life I'd simply decided not to be curious about. 12 years old and 9 years old. I missed birthdays I didn't know existed. 8. The meeting. It took 4 months to arrange the first visit, cautious, heavily negotiated, Nadia insisting on meeting on neutral ground, a restaurant rather than either family's home, with Marcus present from the beginning rather than introduced later as a formality. Peter arrived early, Nadia noted, a detail that surprised her, and stood when they walked in, visibly uncertain how to greet granddaughters he was meeting for the first time at ages 12 and 9 rather than as infants, a normal developmental gap he had no template for. Simone, characteristically direct, solved the awkwardness within the first 10 minutes by informing her grandfather, unprompted, about the feeding behavior of baleen whales, a monologue Peter listened to with a startled, delighted attention that made something in Nadia's chest ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. The specific ache of watching her father be, for the first time, exactly the kind of present, curious grandfather she'd once assumed he simply wasn't capable of being, and understanding that the capability had been there all along, just never extended to her. Amara was more guarded, watching her grandfather with the careful skepticism of a preteen who had absorbed, correctly, that this man had hurt her mother and was not interested in performing forgiveness on anyone's timeline but her own. Peter, to his credit, didn't push it, didn't perform wounded confusion at her distance the way Nadia might once have predicted he would. Marcus and Peter spoke haltingly about engineering and accounting, two disciplines that turned out to share more overlapping logic than either had expected, and by the end of the dinner, something had shifted incrementally, not resolved but begun. 9. What didn't come back? What Nadia understood, in the months that followed, watching her father build a slow, careful relationship with her daughters, Sunday phone calls with Simone about ocean documentaries, an awkward but genuine attempt to learn about Amara's sneaker resale business, a birthday card for each girl that actually referenced something specific about who they were rather than a generic sentiment, was that this repair, however real, could not retroactively populate 12 and 9 years of absence. Peter had missed Amara's first steps, her first day of kindergarten, the specific ferocity with which she negotiated her first business deal at age 10. He had missed Simone's birth entirely, had never held her as an infant, had missed the exact moment, captured on Marcus's phone and treasured by the whole family, when 3-year-old Simone had correctly identified a photograph of a blue whale on a museum wall before any adult in the room could. Those years did not return because a Forbes photograph had forced a reckoning. They remained, permanently, a gap in the family's shared history, not filled, only acknowledged, a specific kind of loss that no number of future Sundays could fully offset. Nadia found, too, that something in her own certainty had shifted in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely welcome. For 17 years, her father's absence from her life had been simple, in its way, a clean, if painful, story about a man who couldn't accept her choices. Watching him show up, imperfectly but genuinely, for her daughters complicated that story in ways she was still working through. It was harder to be angry at a man actively trying than at one who'd simply failed. It was also, she found, not actually less painful, just painful in a new, less familiar shape. The garden. On a Sunday in late autumn, 8 months after the phone call she'd let ring, Nadia knelt in the community garden with both daughters, pulling the last of the season's tomato plants, dirt under her nails, Meridian Bell Capital, and its $340 million in assets entirely absent from her mind for the first time in what felt like weeks. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother, a photo of Peter on his back porch, holding up a small ceramic whale Simone had made him at a pottery class Nadia had recently started taking with the girls on weekends, his expression somewhere between pride and something that looked, unmistakably, like grief for time he couldn't get back. "He's been showing everyone at the coffee shop," Elena had written. "He tells them it's from his granddaughter." I don't think he said granddaughter out loud that many times in his whole life before this year. Nadia looked at the photograph for a long moment, then set the phone face down in the dirt beside her and returned to the tomato plants, to Simone narrating something about whale migration patterns, to Amara calculating, half out loud, the profit margin on a sneaker drop she was tracking on her phone despite Nadia's rule about no devices in the garden. She understood, glad her father knew now. She was also, in a way she suspected would never fully resolve, still grieving the version of this relationship where he had simply asked, all those years ago, instead of assuming, where being known hadn't required a magazine cover to force the door open, where $400 million under management hadn't been the specific, external proof required before her family finally, belatedly, decided she was worth calling.